entrepreneur's mind is a very dangerous place. We want to be as replaceable as possible.
You can, but why would you ever do this? That's not why you started your company.
What would you do if you could only work 1 hour per day?
My guest today is Ari Meisel. He's the founder of Less Doing and a coach to many of the world's best coaches. He's written multiple books on productivity, including The Replaceable Founder. Of course, he's had multiple successes and failures of his own. If you believe, like I do, that success is all about your systems, processes, and your ability to properly value your time, then this is the episode for you. I'm Adam Spector, a 4-time founder, investor in 200 plus startups, and CEO of Chore. We help founders outsource operations so they have more time, which is the only finite resource in the universe. Let's dive in. Ari Meisel, got that in there from the man himself. With me today. It's a funny story how we met. So we got introduced by a buddy of mine who I got to know in San Francisco, who has built this great app around using voice to communicate for everything. And he was like, we just started chatting. He's like, oh, you got it. And he told me about Ari. And it's like, oh my God, I got to meet Ari. And it just so happened that I was heading out to New Jersey and was in town, and he was in town, and he was kind enough to meet. And of course, everything Ari has done, I'll give the quick overview in a second, completely relates to stuff that it's just very much stuff that I utterly love. So it was a huge amount of joy to get to meet Ari and now to have him on the podcast. So Ari, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I was like having a fun conversation.
Good. So to give a quick background on you, and you can please fill in the blanks where I get this all wrong, have built a number of businesses very successfully. I think kind of almost everything you touch turns to gold in some ways. Maybe not, may not say that, but I know a lot of things do. You've written a number of books, from The Art of Doing Less, The Replaceable Founder, Less Doing, More Living, Intro to Biohacking. You've coached 2,000 plus people, including you're the coach to many of the most world famous coaches out there. And if I recall from one of our conversations, you got introduced as like the efficiency god. I'm sure I got that completely wrong, right in front of Tim Ferriss, and it pissed him off massively. So what parts did I get wrong and what parts did I get right in explaining your overall background?
No, that was pretty spot on. Yeah.
All right, good. Before we kick it off, I'd really like to ask people at a high level, this is about entrepreneurial excellence. How do you even define excellence? And maybe I'll preface that by saying something that you also said to me, which I thought was really amazing. You said, because I asked you a similar question when we were in person, and I basically said, you basically said, like, success to me is the fact that my kids, when they tell other people what I do, it's that I'm a volunteer EMT. And that was, is that actually how you would define success, or how do you define entrepreneurial excellence?
I think what I said was that would be very content, but no, that's not how I would necessarily define success. I would say that my definition of success in general is that if I am better today than I was yesterday in any way, a better business person, better negotiator, better father, better friend, whatever it is, if I'm improving, I'm a big believer in the idea of Kaizen, right? The Japanese philosophy of continual change for the good. So if I am improving, then I am being successful.
How do you know as a founder or individual that you are improving, or is it more just of a mentality idea that you are always?
So I think it's a mentality. There are definitely ways of measuring some of these things. I think weaving this into the entrepreneurial excellence question is an interesting one, because a lot of times, so one of the things that I've noticed over the years of doing what I do is that more and more I feel like my job is to protect the entrepreneur's team from the entrepreneur's mind. An entrepreneur's mind is a very dangerous place for people who are not in the entrepreneurial spirit. And, you can categorize entrepreneurs as a lot of other things that you might see in the mental health manual, basically, right? So ADHD, psychopaths, a lot of CEOs and entrepreneurs are psychopathic in some ways. And a lot of those things make for those people that where other people see problems, entrepreneurs see opportunities, where there is a certain amount of risk that would crush anybody else's soul. Entrepreneurs feel like that's a Tuesday, and that's obviously a good thing, because we get really interesting innovations out of that. We get really, hopefully, impactful companies out of that. But on the face of it, like objectively on paper, I feel like a lot of those things are not good things. So it's a really interesting question, right? The entrepreneurial excellence. Like, does that mean you're being really good at being an entrepreneur? Which in some ways, I don't know if that's a good thing. Because again, like, one of the things I would say is an amazing trait of a leader, not necessarily an entrepreneur, but a leader, is when they're able to communicate success very well, empower people in a very good way, and ultimately focus on what they do best and leave the rest to other people in a trusted setting. Entrepreneurs are notoriously bad at that. They want to micromanage, and a lot of that becomes the value of them is the value of the company in a way, right? Like, it was my idea. I created it. If I'm not here and I'm not needed, I'm not doing this thing, then what am I? And then they start to take out all sorts of weird things on people, right? The other thing is that we get this thing which I call LIFO leadership. Do you remember, LIFO and FIFO from Accounting 101?
Yeah.
Right. So LIFO, last in, first out. Yeah. So you get this thing where an entrepreneur has a great idea, where they go to a conference, they read a book, and then they go to their team like the next hour and they're like, this is what we're doing. We're changing everything. And this is what we have to do. And then most of the time the team will shift and do that, right? Because the last thing they heard is the first thing they're going to work on. And then priorities get missed and everybody's pissed off and it just doesn't work. There's an old joke. It's a stupid old joke, but I always like to tell this because I think it gives sort of a good example of what I'm talking about, which is why don't cowboys skydive? Because it scares the crap out of their horses. Right. And so like in a lot of situations, the entrepreneur is that cowboy and the team is the workhorse, and they're just sort of like along for the ride blindly. And this doesn't describe every entrepreneur, but it definitely describes a lot. So, and it's very, very hard from an ego standpoint for someone to start something and then recognize that they're not the person that's going to grow it necessarily, or they're not the person that's going to grow it to $10 million in revenue or beyond that. And the replaceable founder came out of a lot of that, right? The idea is that we want to be as replaceable as possible, which means creating systems and processes that replace what we do well so we can ultimately focus on what we're best at.
So what I find though, founders are, this is probably your point, are notoriously terrible at building those processes, number one, following those processes, and then replacing themselves. This is sort of a thesis with my own company, Chore, which is you delegate and hand off all of your back office operations. And so many founders we come across say, well, I can do that myself. And yes, you can, but why would you ever do this? It's not why you started your company. And that is a pet peeve of mine for my own business, but it happens across the spectrum. So how do founders get good at saying, okay, I'm going to delegate things, hand them off, and give up a little bit of control?
It's so interesting because it's like the blind leading the blind in like extreme sense, right? Because like we don't, I went to the Wharton School of Business for an undergraduate degree, and it's it's one of, if not the best business schools in the world. And I feel like, and I didn't go into finance, so that's one caveat. But I feel like the things that I learned in my first 3 years out of college, working in construction and real estate development with my hands in like the dirt, I learned more in those in a month than I learned in the entire time I was at Wharton. And that's not to discredit Wharton. It was an excellent institution that gave me a really good foundation. But we don't learn this stuff, and they don't teach a lot of this stuff. So the other thing to understand is that, especially in an entrepreneurial environment where a company can be growing really quickly, more quickly than another company, like more sort of structured scenario might, is that, again, the person that can take a company from 1 million to 3 million or 3 million to 10 million, they're probably not the person that can take it from 10 to 100. It's very rare. I've seen it maybe 2 times where somebody was able to effectively do that. But the other thing is that keep in mind that the person that is growing a company that is 1 to 10 million may still have some sort of a work-life integration happening. And once you get over 10 million, it's really, it's a very sort of different scenario, right? So like your entire being in life in some ways has to change with you to become that next person. And again, it does happen in rare situations, but like, I'm not willing to do that, and I never was willing to do that in my businesses.
So how do you get to be, what are the steps you need to do to get there? Is it following your kind of core framework for like simplify, automate, outsource from the replaceable founder? Is that something just everyone should be following every day? Is that the mentality, or?
Yeah. So it's optimize, automate, outsource in that order. And automation is such it's just a totally different bend to it now than it did, 5 years ago, even certainly 10 or 15 years ago when I wrote that. Far too often people are kind of looking at how can I add something, right? What's this new software, this new person I can hire that can then make things all perfect and easy and amazing? And a lot of times it's really about taking things away and paring things back, and really restrictions to me in many ways. So OAO, which is the framework, is definitely something I think about on a moment-to-moment basis in some cases. But even simpler than that is restrictions, right? So my whole system, my whole career came from a simple question. What would you do if you could only work 1 hour per day? And that was a very real scenario I found myself in because of a chronic illness I got diagnosed with when I was 23, where that was my limit. And it's a very mind-bending, I feel like, way of thinking through things for some people, because ultimately the question at that point is not really what would you do if you only had an hour, it's what wouldn't you do if you only had an hour. And if those things that you wouldn't do still need to get done, then who or what is going to do them for you? So always sort of thinking through that. And that brings in the replaceable founder idea, that brings in OAO. I think that entrepreneurs particularly, and leaders in general, have a very hard time serving the people that work for them in some ways, right?
So like serving leadership.
Yeah. And I do think that it really is our job in many ways as leaders to sort of, we can set a vision and we can clarify that vision and convey it. But then ultimately, I feel like our job is to remove obstacles as much as possible for the people that work for us or with us. And that may be the thing that you are the best at. And just to do a quick example of that. So I had a client who was a really, really talented copywriter, and he was creating information products and selling that. The company was doing like at least 12 million a year or something. And basically he came to me because he had been trying for 3 years to hire a copywriter that could take that on and sort of run things while he was doing CEO stuff. And the very first conversation we had, I was like, why aren't you hiring a CEO and you be the copywriter? And it was like he had never thought of that as a possibility. And that's why he ultimately, because he liked copywriting, he was really good at it. It's like, so why are you trying to be a CEO? You know, like I'm a coach and I love coaching. I have this is not my situation now because I run a very, very lean operation, but I have no problem having a COO or a CEO in my company that would tell me what to do. And, you know, I just want to be able to show up a coach.
Yeah. How do founders then build some of those systems in place? And I asked me, I'll use a personal example, sort of two actually, for me. So I think I'm decent at building processes. Like that's a core thesis of what we are as a company at Shore. And yet my process broke down 2 ways in the past 24 hours. It really frustrated me and I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And I said, I think I'm better than many. One example was our whole thesis when we have a whole process for sending out a script of what we want to talk about to our podcast guests. So you're a good example of this. Yesterday afternoon, I was looking for the script. What's the deal? I assume it had been already sent out to you. It hadn't been sent at all. And I was pretty frustrated. I was like, hey team, like we have a whole process. Why am this only coming up when I finally come up for air yesterday afternoon? Those in something broke down in the process. And then same thing, we actually had a customer this morning who we have a whole process for. I was just checking in with him. And he said, oh my God, there's all these issues we're having right now, which is something that scares me. And I'm like, why is it taking me as a CEO to reach out at that point to find out that there's an issue when like the team who's working with that client should really be doing that? Once again, we have a process for this. So something broke and I'm frustrated at my team, but I'm more frustrated that our process somehow broke down. And where did we go wrong, or where did I go wrong?
So without knowing a lot more specifics that I would need to know, but I mean, well, one thing is how are the processes stored? Are you using a tool that stores the process?
Yeah. We write everything. We have a single tool for essentially all of our stuff. We use ClickUp for everything. All of our processes are in ClickUp. The tracking of all the work is in ClickUp. The time tracking, when things are done, the checklist, everything's in ClickUp, including communication, except with clients, which is either in Slack or email.
And were you able to go back and look at where the process broke down there?
No. So I've asked them to give me an update on what the process is and review it with them.
I mean, that's the first thing, obviously, right? But the thing is ultimately really want to create a culture around that where people are always looking at how we can improve those things. Things are going to break. Like that's going to happen. We know that's going to happen. And obviously, like for super critical processes, we need to have ideally automations in place that will catch things when they don't happen. But so it is frustrating. But to me, it's sort of like an interesting opportunity for you as the founder, right? To be like, not only why did this process break, but why do our processes break in general? Because I'm almost would guarantee that it's not something that's only in this process. And I would also probably guess that it is a human element that got messed up. Right. So one of the things that I always talk about with automation is automation is great because it's cheap. Usually it's cheaper. It, never gets sick, 24/7, all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, for me, the benefit of automation is the removal of errors. That's how I like to think about automation, right? Because it's something that we don't have to have a human be involved in. And even if the automation screws up, usually most systems like Zapier and stuff allow us to have another system in place that lets you know that something didn't work or didn't complete. So that's why the optimize, automate, outsource framework is what it is, right? So we optimize for it. We look at what we have and we optimize, remove any unnecessaries, remove duplicates, whatever it is there. And we look at the automations. And then if there's anything left over at that point, that's when we look at people. We really want to use people as a last resort, not only because people are fallible, but also because if you give automatable work to a human, you are in essence dehumanizing them. They won't engage with that work. It won't be that. So on the face of it, this is a great opportunity to look at why the process didn't work.
Quick question then. It's like when we want people to, so I like to think of the idea of like, I don't automate until I have a good idea of how to build the process itself. So like when it's, you first have to understand it before you can automate it. So when you put that in place, how much work did you manually first before you try to automate something?
A lot, usually, honestly, because otherwise all we're doing, we may very well be automating like, the bomb going faster into the ground, basically, right? Technology, I love technology, but technology amplifies habits, right? It's going to make good habits better and bad habits worse, faster. That's all it's going to do. A lot of times also we try to automate something that if we had optimized first, we'd find out that we didn't even need that to process at all to begin with. This is how I teach people to build processes, and this would help in this situation that you're describing. What the way that most people build processes, and I don't know if this is how you did it, doesn't matter. Most people will show someone how to do something and then they'll write it down, which is really actually not very good because we have heuristics, the shortcuts in our brain that we don't know are there, and then we don't convey those. So you show somebody the process, say, all right, now you go do it. Or here's the checklist. Now you go do it that I wrote. That's when we get a lot of breakage. And then a lot of times we don't even know why it happened. The better way to do it is I'm going to show you the process. Now you, the second person, you write down the SOP of what you saw. And you can do this with automated tools now, like Guide and Use Well. There's a lot of tools that allow you to do that if it's a computer-based process. But you show me the process, or you write down the process that you saw. Then you take that checklist, that process, and you give it to a third person, ideally, and you have them run through it. 100% of the time, it's not going to work. And it's great because we get to fix things at an extremely granular level, and you get to find out, oh, this person didn't have the right access. That's why they didn't see that button. Or they had to find this document. They didn't know where it was. So I need to put a link to it. And then once you do that, and sometimes it's very quick, sometimes it can take longer, you get to a process that you've now proven that a tertiary party, not a secondary, a tertiary party can get through without error. And at that point, it's super easy to figure out where and how to automate things. But I've done this with almost 200-step process for one of the largest mortgage banks in the country, where we had 2 offshore VAs go through creating a loan, originating a loan, something that you need to do training for and get certified and get licensed for. And they were able to go through this process of 183 steps or something without any issues because we went through that process. That's an extreme example, but we need to do that to ultimately get processes that really work.
So I can imagine a million excuses, even ones in my own head, that people might have about doing that. Some of the excuses around saying like, it might be, it's too hard to do that. It takes too much time. It's a lot of, why should I make that investment? What is your pushback to people when they make the millions of excuses that they make around automation?
So many. So the psychological and emotional toll of wondering if a process worked is immeasurably bad. Right. So when a founder is feeling overwhelmed, I can't tell you how many times it's like, oh, we have this process for sending gifts to our top clients every month. And did it work? Did that person get the gift? Like that kind of wondering sucks.
Yep, totally.
And and the cost of that, the opportunity cost of your brain doing that is huge. And if you don't recognize that, then you don't value your own time and brain and energy.
A lot of people, there's nothing we should talk about because people are terrible at valuing their time, but I hear you. You're right.
We can touch on that for sure. But then the other thing is that it's a muscle, right? So there are absolutely been times where I spent 20 minutes to automate something that would save me 20 seconds. But that 20-second thing might have been I might be doing that 50 times a day, right? And small hinges swing big doors, right? So we need to exercise that muscle of creating processes, because at the end of, I don't need to do this 3-part process now anymore because I've been doing this for so long. And eventually you get to the point where you don't need the third part to go through it. You can start to see the issues that come up over and over again. But it's fine if you don't want to do that, but you can't scale and you can't become replaceable if you don't.
When people come up with the excuses around like whether to build a process, whether to make that investment, how do you help them think through, going to the time piece? To me, what you're describing is essentially an investment, right? I'm making an investment in my process, which will lead to a better outcome for my business or me as an individual. However, once again, I come across a ton of people who fail the basic metrics around investment in the first place. Like they don't really get, they get like, I'm investing in the stock market, it's going to make me a return. They don't understand it when it comes to their personal work or time. How do you work through that just mindset to start with, where this is what you're describing as an investment? I need to take an investment up front in building good process because it's going to save me more time long term and create better, more delightful outcomes for my team, my client, my customers, being able.
So the question really at that point for most people is not, should I invest in creating more processes because it's a lot of time? The question at that point really becomes a misallocation of understanding where your efforts are best spent overall, right? Because you may have somebody who loves process design and they love the nitty-gritty and they like Excel spreadsheets, all that kind of stuff. And they're going to be like, yeah, this is what I want to do. I'm going to be in here. And most people, I would say the majority of entrepreneurial people are not in that mindset. There are some, but most of them are not. A lot of the entrepreneurs are thinking like, oh, I need to be with the team and like, inspiring and then come up with new ideas, which again, maybe one of the things that they do, but it's a lot easier to be like, I just want to do the thing I want to do because that's the thing I'm best at, when that really ultimately may not be the best thing for the company or for the vision that you're trying to create. So I can give you a really crystal clear example, in my opinion. Using outsourced talent for personal stuff. Okay. So one of the things that I've always been a huge proponent of is using like virtual assistants and graphic designers, or if I need to, or whatever it is, for stuff in my home. And there's always pushback for that. And I have had many, many months where I have done more outsourcing for my home than I have for my business, to like multiples of 4, 5, 6 times. Let's do VAs, for example, right? So I have 5 children. There's a lot of stuff to sort of deal with in our household. And the pushback that a lot of people give is that there's no ROI, right, on spending that kind of money in their home life. Like, I'm going to have a VA, like do my grocery list. Like, where do I see the return on that? Which is so silly to think that way, right? But for camp forms, right, there's like 1,000 forms to fill out in my case times 5. Does it make sense for me, with one brain and one body, right, to be super efficient, outsource, streamlined at work, and then I come home and I'm stressed out and I have to fill out paperwork for an hour, and I'm like, oh, I got to fill these out and it's got to be done. Does it show more love to my children if I fill them out myself, or if I outsource that to somebody else to do it, and then I can go back to focusing on other things, right? The ROI is immeasurable, in my opinion, in that case, right? So like I would spend money on that all day long if I could get my time and my mind and attention back.
So I totally agree. And in fact, I sort of do the same thing. Like we have a house cleaner. I use a washing machine, a dishwasher. But I generally don't cook a lot of my food, right? We outsource a lot of that too. But how does a founder decide, like in that case, to camp forms? What process did you create a single document with all your key information about all of your kids that you share with your VA? Like what upfront investment did you put to make that work?
So that's a really good question. What you see in business a lot of times, and this translates over, is that a lot of times people will treat a task like I can't. So with some of the pushback that I get a lot of times is like, oh, I don't want to spend the time on this process, and like we're only doing this once, right? Or we only do this once a quarter or once a year. Like BS. There are very few tasks or processes in your business and my business and anybody's business that are true one-offs, or even like a part of it, at least are not one-offs. Like it just doesn't happen. But yet you get this like immediate sort of knee-jerk reaction. Oh no, we rarely do that. It's not worth it. I don't care if once a month I have to balance the books myself, whatever. Right. So
I've been pet peeve on that. I came across a founder who was like, oh yeah, I do my books every month myself, no problem. And I was like, that's why you're still 6 years and you haven't reached your Series A yet.
Yeah.
But he didn't understand that.
That's right. Yeah. And so So because the process, the camp examples are a really good one, right? The kids that I have now are the same kids I had last year and the same kids that I had the year before when I originally gave the information to my virtual assistants, right? And the last year, maybe they needed 2 more things that they didn't have. And this year they needed 3 more things that they didn't have. So we build on that. But like these processes are not going away, just like my kids are not going away. So it's not so much like, oh, I need to spend an hour up front giving this information. I can understand that I'm going through a process here and I have to feed information as it's needed, but then I won't have to do it again.
Agreed. How do you then go through, maybe back a step further, right? Kind of peeling the onion a little bit. How do you find and trust the people to do the work themselves? So what I mean by that is like, I've gone through a lot of different VAs. Sometimes they seem great. They don't work out for various reasons. I don't think it's me. It might be. But like, I try to put a lot of investment in, like, here's all the information, here's all the best the practices, all that other stuff. And yet there still seem to be, it doesn't seem to work out. And so you get to a point where like, hey, can I trust it? Is it worth, and we hear this from our customers sometimes where they're like, hey, like, I love the idea of what Chore offers, but I don't want to spend time training someone to go do this work. How do you answer that? And then how do you say like, you will find someone who's great, who will stick, like it's worth the investment. And then how do you find that great person who you can trust?
Yeah, so first of all, I always like the sort of the Neil deGrasse Tyson take on this, which is about communication, which is like, if I throw a ball to you and you don't catch it, it's my fault because I didn't throw it in a way that you could catch it. I think that's the only way we can kind of approach it, unless you have somebody like malicious, which is very, I'd say that's pretty rare. We have to treat trust as a spectrum, right? So it's not binary. It's like, how can I, because they get that question all the time, right? How can I trust someone to do it? It's like, well, you could trust them to order something on Amazon. It doesn't mean you're going to trust them to watch your kids, right? So it's not like there's trust and no trust. So one of the ways, and the binary thing is really, was the kickoff for me to create something called the 6 levels of delegation. So it's a process, or it's a framework that I teach where there's a sort of a sliding scale of not so much trust, but how much empowerment you're giving somebody. There's 6 levels. Level 1 is just do what I say, right? So like, I don't want your opinion. I don't want your input. Just do the thing, right? Buy this book on Amazon with my credit card. That's it. I don't want a different book. I don't want a different price. I don't want you to tell me there's another thing I can do. Just do the thing. Level 4 is decide. You make the decision, but you inform me, right? So you keep me in a loop on that. Level 5, which is one of my favorites, is decide within limits. So that's where you're saying to somebody like, if it's a $500 or less decision, I don't need to know about it. You do you, make it happen, or a time or space. And then level 6 is a complete flip where you're saying, just get it done. And level 6 is really interesting because that is the full trust, because you're not only saying, I completely trust you to get this done. If the result that you come back with is not something I like, that's my fault because I put you level 6. But it also means that I recognize that any involvement of my part at this point would only hinder the process, and I'm going to step back and let you do you. That definitely takes time to sort of develop the level of trust. But what's important is we fill out this actual worksheet and we give that to the person we're delegating to. And again, this takes time up front, but eventually it sort of becomes a muscle memory thing. Different tasks and different people are going to warrant different levels of empowerment/trust from you. So not every task is trust or don't trust.
So it just depends on the task and everything else. And then, but how, you don't want to micromanage either, right? You don't want to micromanage that task. You don't want to micromanage. At some point, you just sort of say, I'm going to trust you to do the spectrum of things and get them done.
Yes. But, and then one of the things that is a really important sort of dynamic of especially working with not just outsourced people, but people in other time zones, is there is this sort of like crisscross or converging sort of lines, right? Where it's a lot of people, they don't want to be hassled, right? They want to give a task. They don't want to ask, don't ask me a million questions. That's not really the issue for a lot of people. For a lot of people, the issue is the delay. So I'll give you an example. When I was running a virtual assistant company for a couple of years, one of the hardest tasks for us to ever do for people with satisfaction was book travel. Because what would inevitably happen, right, is a client would say like, hey, I need tickets, from Newark to Phoenix on this date, whatever. Okay. 6 hours later, the assistant would get back to them and be like, okay, I looked it up. Here's the prices. Do you want a window seat? They'd come back 7 hours later. Yeah, I want a window seat. And that sounds good. It's $250. Like, great. 7 hours later, they'd come back and now the price is $350. Now they had to go back and they find like, oh, the price went up $100. And it was just always a mess. there's one virtual assistant company in particular that has the fastest response time of any company I've ever worked with, and it is like 45 seconds, 24/7, and they've done a lot of work to make that happen. And in that scenario, it's not such a big deal for them to come back to you a minute later and be like, "Do you want this seat?" No, great. 3 minutes later, "Do you want this one? It's this price." "Yeah, great. Okay, book it." That becomes a lot more okay. And if you recognize, like, I'm going to outsource this, the person is not necessarily fully competent, I don't fully trust them, there's going to be a little back and forth, but we're going to wrap this up in 15 minutes. That's okay.
So how do you get to a point? I mean, that with that company, what do you do to get to a point where you can be that fast in your sort of responses and asking? Because I think with any outsource, really anybody on your team, it could be even internal. I mean, I find the same thing with internal people. If you just hear silence for 24 hours while someone's figuring it out, it creates a high level of anxiety. How do you remove that anxiety within your team or external people you're working with to become that delightful partner where we tell our team this all the time, you don't have to have the answer, you just need to respond quickly. But I don't think we don't have anywhere close to that response time that you described. How does a company get good or an individual get good at that level? You know, like, I can't respond right now. I'm on this call with you, so I can't respond to any messages I'm receiving. How do you get good as a company to still have fast responses?
Well, generally we could get about setting expectations, right? And some, like, I've worked with people who are amazing at this. Like I'm at the rescue squad that I'm the vice president of, where I'm a volunteer EMT. The president is amazing at this. Every week he sends, like, on Monday I'm going to be in the office from 9 to 4, to 12, and then I'm going to be out. This way I'm going to be traveling. I'm going to be over here. Like, very, very good about that. And so where he's going to be when, and that sort of sets that expectation. Also, it's like, when you're delegating a task, you can say, "Hey, I know that there's going to be some back and forth on this. Let me know if you need anything. Like, I'll be available at this time if you want to, get it done." Like, so that's why I said it's probably you. And I mean, I'm, being cheeky, obviously, but it's true. Like, there's two things that we generally do a bad job at. Everybody does a bad job at when they're delegating. One is conveying what success looks like. And I'll give a specific example about that with flight, actually. And then the other one is thinking through the resources that any reasonable person might need to complete this task. And that might sound like a heavy lift, but it's really not. If you book travel, you know that you need an ID. You know that you need a way of paying for it. And you know that you probably, depending on what the airline or the travel, whatever it is, that you might need, like, a rewards number, right? That's not news. But every time we would have clients be like, "Oh, I need my credit card. Here it is." Like, "Oh, it's like, yeah, we're booking travel. We're booking international travel. We need a passport." So it's not crazy. So to think through a little bit in advance and be like, if I were to do this task, I need these things. Anybody else would also need these things. I'm not going to wait for them to ask for them and sort of like set someone up for failure. That doesn't take 10 minutes to figure out. That takes 20 seconds to sort of think through. And not only that, once you think through what those resources are, now in the future, you can make those resources more available in a more easily accessible way. Like, maybe you put your passport in Dashland or 1Password and you can show that to people. But the travel example and what success looks like, right? So this particular company I'm referring to, that with the 24/7 fast response. So for a couple of years, I was going to Toronto every quarter for this meeting that I would go to. And I would basically I would take like a 5:30 a.m. flight to be there by 8 o'clock. And then I would come back that night. And success for me is getting to the meeting on time, right? That's success. So 5:30 and 5:15 in the morning, one morning, I'm sitting at the terminal, I'm supposed to board in like 15 minutes. I'm like half asleep, drinking a cup of coffee. And I get a text from the VA company because they had booked a travel. And they said, "Your flight's been canceled for some engine issue. But don't worry, we booked you on this other flight. It was $100 more, but it was the only one that was available now. And getting you there on time, go to gate B6. And I looked at this and I'm like, okay. So I get up and I like wearily start walking away, and I got about 100 feet away from the gate. And then they made an announcement at the gate and everybody went nuts, right? Because they're supposed to board and they didn't know what they're doing. I'm just like, okay. And I walked over to this other flight and I got on. So they knew that the $100 didn't matter. They knew that I needed to get there. That was what success looks like. And they already had the resources to do it. That's one of my greatest like outsourcing success stories ever.
Yeah. Huge win. And for them as a process, since you built a company in the VA space too, what were the metrics that a company like that puts in place, or any of the companies you work with, where there's like, this this small little thing on a fast response time, having key information in a level of autonomy that they felt comfortable doing all those things. Like that is building up many processes over time in like a culture of excellence. How do they put that in place? How do companies replicate things like that? Because that stuff, it sounds really easy at the surface, but I know it's really difficult. And many companies overlook the small things because they want to build the big shiny object or product.
So one of the biggest things that people have to get over in their companies and their personal lives, everything, is I do whatever I can to avoid a dedicated anything.
What do you mean?
And this is right. So this is completely opposite to how much people. So VAs are a good example, right? You can get a dedicated VA, or you can get an on-demand VA service. So dedicated VAs where you have that one person. They know who you are. They know the flowers that your wife likes. They know like they know you. They know your company. Sounds really great, but it's a huge liability because that is trained knowledge, and there's also knowledge gained that you don't necessarily know about. And furthermore, there's a bandwidth issue, right? Not only could that person quit, which would be the worst situation, but maybe they get sick. Maybe they had a bad day. Maybe you need something outside of their office, their working hours, right? So I always tell people, like, I want you to have on-demand personal assistants. You should have on-demand graphic designer, coder. Like, we never want to have one if we can, because it's a pinch point. And my VA service was like this as well. We ran out, it was a marketplace essentially. So we had at one point at peak, I think we had about 185 VAs, and the clients would put their task into a pool, and whoever was available and had the skill set could grab it as quickly as possible. And that was the only way that we could ensure that people would get to it quickly, right? Because we had people in every time zone essentially. There was a competitive aspect to it. There was a hunger to that. So 5:30 in the morning, if I had this dedicated VA that knew everything about me and all my passwords and credit cards and everything, that's great, but they're not helping me at 5:30 in the morning. And I wouldn't bother them at 5:30 in the morning either. That's a big shift for a lot of people, because there's a cultural issue where it's always like, well, this one person that I'm going to put all this training into and they're going to get to know me and that's going to be such a benefit. It really isn't. And it's just sort of digging you further into a hole that it's just people don't get that.
But then how do you get to a point where you also like this pool of VAs has the skills or they have the information they need to work on any person's task, right? They have to come in and say, okay, I see this new booking request from a random person I've never worked for before. They have to have all the key information about the credit card, the needs and wants in place. And like, so how did you ensure the data structures and the processes were in place to essentially, and the people would match properly? Well, if you had the skills to book flights, you're a person who could be in queue for that job.
There's a lot more challenging back then. Now with AI, this is so much easier, right? Because you can have dossiers essentially on every client and have a knowledge base. Be like, how does Mr. Smith like to travel? And it will give all that information. Also, credit card wise, like one of the things we did was we didn't have 180 VAs that access people's credit cards. They would be able to use a company card, and then we would charge the client's card, right? So they didn't necessarily have to have that. And so there were systems and processes for that kind of stuff, but the goal was speed in many cases, and obviously quality, of course. At the end of the day, in order to work with on-demand services, you need to have really good processes, and that's sort of like the upward trickle in a way that creates. So if you want to have different if you want to use a service like Design Pickle or Penji to do your design work, you need to have a branding guide. You need to have that stuff makes sense. You need to know what your font colors are and what your logo. Which you should anyway, right? But you need that. And once you do, then you can work with anybody. And I would even go so far as to say this. I think that the majority of training that companies do is there to compensate for poor process.
I love that. Okay. So once again, you'd go back then to build a better process in the first place, and then you don't need as much training.
Yeah. And at some point, you need less and less human involvement, to the point that the human involvement is the part that's really like the secret sauce in a way, or like the human connection element that we do want.
And so essentially the reason, so maybe repeat it differently, basically saying if you build a great process and you to be good at building these processes, you vet them, run through that 3-part process that you sort of said, like I built it the first time, someone else then has to go, I maybe write down my steps, they have to essentially rebuild it, and then they have a third person to try to run what they built, and do that essentially for every single thing that we have. And then you start getting to a place where you don't need as much training because it's so straightforward that they can't make mistakes.
Correct. And then now again, we can automate so much of that stuff, but you really can do that until you go through those first few steps. But then what happens is the whole idea with the replaceable founders, we want to replace people at every level of the company up, not out. Right. So you free up somebody to move up, because if you can't be promoted, if you can't be replaced, you can't be promoted.
Yep. Yeah, no, and it's funny. We talk about that as well internally at Tor all the time with people, because they get scared. We say, hey, look, we want to use overseas talent for some more things, or we want to use AI for different things. And people get worried, like, that's going to take my job. And it's like, if you're worried it's going to take your job, then maybe you're not doing a valuable of enough job. You should be working toward doing something that is super high value that can't be replaced, and keep moving yourself off the things that can be replaced, since that's almost once again the metric that we do at the company ourselves. So I know we have to be really tight on time, so I'm going to be really quick. I'm going to go. I could keep asking so many questions about process and automation because it's so critical. But like, things you entrepreneurs overall, what are some of the other key heuristics that people do for like building great process, building great products, getting customers, hiring a team? Do you have any key heuristics or mental notes on how to do all three of those well?
So for hiring great people, I think that one of the things that's always been more telling for me and really eye-opening, and I created an automated hiring process in our VA company where we had like 2% turnover. I hired 180 people in 6 months. It's so much more valuable to see how people perform in a bad situation than in a good one. And yeah, so I'll explain. And also, there's only 4 questions that I ask in any interview, and not just VAs, in general. So the bad thing. So let's say we're hiring a copywriter, I never wanted to be like, send me your portfolio. I'd like to see, the kind of writing you do. That doesn't help me, because I don't know if that piece that they sent me was edited 5 times, was, vetted by one of the greatest copywriters in the world that happened to be their godfather.
Yep.
And that's what they're presenting me with now. What I would always say is, here's a really crappy piece of copy, make it better. Right? You give a coder a website, this button doesn't work, fix it. Right? And then we had this really simple, great test for the VAs. There's a sample task. So the task was, and it was a real task that we got. And I guess I don't know why the person didn't just Google this themselves, but basically they're like, I'm staying at this hotel. It was a real hotel in Texas, in Dallas. And I have 1,000 envelopes that are stamped, ready to go. I just need to know where's the nearest place I can mail them. So so basically we gave that to the people and we said, how would you respond to this? The worst answer, which we got all the time, was people were like, oh, I'll look into that right now for you, sir, and I'll get back to you. That was what people would actually submit. They'd be like, okay, I'm not trying to see if you're polite. I want to see if you can actually get this. So that was an automatic rejection. Second one was the people that Googled the answer. And the Google answer said that the nearest post office was 4.8 miles away. And basically enjoy your, hour and a half walk.
Right. And also that person could Google it themselves very quickly.
They could, right. The right answer was, and this happened sort of unbeknownst to us until I found out that it was such a perfect test. The right answer was, sir, I just called the concierge at the hotel. His name is Roger, by the way. And he's informed us that there's a FedEx office at the hotel that will gladly accept your envelopes. And if you'd like, they can have somebody come up to the room to get them from you. After about 3 months, I actually called the hotel and I was like, hey, is this Roger? I was like, you probably get a lot of calls from our applicants. Just want to give you some content. He thought it was really funny. Because he'd be getting this request over and over. But that's a really good one, right? Because it shows productivity, it shows attention to detail. It also shows context. I'm not going to tell somebody walk 4.5 miles. There's got to be a better way, right? So there's things like that. The 4 questions that I always ask are two are softballs, two are not. So the first one is, why you? Second one is why us, right? Those are pretty straightforward. And a lot of times people will have polished answers to those. The third question is always, tell me about a time you screwed up at work and how you handled it. And what I personally look for there is a lot of we language rather than I language. So we had this report that was late for clients and I worked through the night and got it done because I knew I had to get done. That's great. It shows hard work, and it's not bad. But what I prefer to hear is I was late. So I actually looped in a colleague who was really good with this particular, coding set, and we worked together. And then I let my boss know that we were running late, but I was going to do, so this collaborative idea. So that's really good. But then the fourth question is if I don't hire you, why do you think that will be? And that is the gut punch for most people, and produces some of the worst answers ever that anybody would be like, nope, no thanks. The most common one is, well, I'm sure there's just so many great candidates and maybe I don't stand out in one. And it's like, well, yeah, you definitely nailed that one. Because the thing is, that question is asking somebody to have some self-awareness about how they showed up in the interview. And so like my answer to that, granted, I've had 20 years of practice on this, but my answer is always like, I know that I probably appear like someone's kind of a lone wolf. Like I like to do my own thing. I like to do it my way. I get it that that's how I come off. But I have worked in so many different teams where I was not the leader and I did this and that, But again, I understand that's how I come off because in a lot of ways I do know what I think is best, but I do like to be collaborative as well. Right. So like that's me saying like, I get it. I understand, like that's how I come off. And I'm working but I can work within that environment and that kind of thing. So those are hard answers to prepare for, and you get to really see someone at their worst in a way. As far as products, right? So creating a great product, I get feedback and get it early, right? And try to really push for negative feedback. So there is an exercise from the 1970s, the psychologist created it, called ritual dissent, DISSENT. You ever heard of it?
Have not.
Okay. This is the greatest team building exercise and process ever. And I do this with groups. Every time I run a workshop, I do this. So you break up into groups, and the groups are whatever size you want, but like let's say groups of 4. Let's say you have 4 groups of 4. The biggest I ever did this with was, I think it was 10 groups of 5, and that took almost 4 hours, and it was unbelievable. But basically, the one person is designated as the pitcher in each of the groups, and that person has 1 minute to pitch an idea. And you can say like an idea of how we can improve the company, how we can improve the product. 1 minute to pitch. Guaranteed most of the time they will not finish their pitch that first minute when they get through that. Anyway, they give their pitch, and then the rest of the people in their little pod have 2 minutes to give nothing but negative feedback. Mm-hmm. And anything that they say or ask, the person cannot respond to. And in fact, the way this was originally designed, the person who's pitching wears a mask, because you're trying to separate the person from the idea. So what we did is we would have the person face away from the group. It's very weird and awkward the first few times, but then they have to give only negative feedback. And again, if they're like, I don't understand how you did this, the person cannot answer them. So then they switch, and that pitcher goes to the next group, and now they can reformulate and use what they learned and repitch their idea. And everybody sort of rotates through. And you keep doing that until everybody's done that. Everybody's gone through 5 groups. And then then you switch the pitcher and you do the same thing. When we did this with my own team at our first retreat, and we had these like 50 people, we got literally $12 million ideas out of that process, and implemented most of them to unbelievable success.
So like pitching ideas that they had, like this just business idea that I had that might help a company. Just come up with whatever and come up with an idea.
Whatever it is, and then let somebody just shoot it down. And one, it gets people comfortable with receiving the feedback. 2, it gets people comfortable with giving the feedback. And again, just like the job interview thing, we learn more from the negative than we do from the positive, honestly. But so many people are just really not good at it, right? So it's an unbelievable thing, and I highly recommend everybody does it in their teams, and it's incredible. So I think that is the best way to like rapidly iterate on how you can improve a product. And then in terms of sales process is so important, and entrepreneurial companies often don't have one. And as with most entrepreneurial companies, right, the entrepreneur is the one who does all the sales until they can't, basically, right? And for many companies, that's $300,000 in revenue. Once you hit $300,000 in revenue, it's really hard for the entrepreneur to keep doing sales. It's just, you get like a switch at that point where you need to really be focused on building those processes out. But what happens then is, so in my company, I want to be as replaceable as possible and be a coach, right? We built the sales process. I had 2 salespeople that were running it. And then what would happen all the time is we'd have clients would be like, hey, Ari, this is a person, I think it'd be a great fit for the program. Could you do their intake? Could you do the sales process? And I would have to be like, no, you don't want that. I don't know what our process is. I don't do our sales process. And the reason that we have such a great program and such a great retention rate and so little churn and so many referrals is because it starts with this amazing sales process that I don't know anything about. So if they go in with me, I'm sure they'll sign up, but they're not going to have that world-class experience that we've come to build. So you need to build a real sales process with scripts, with testing, with feedback, really onboard people the right way.
And does the scripts and sale, the process, all this stuff, is just like constant testing and iterating? So everyone says that. But once again, it just goes back to the whole building a great process. Like you really need to hone it in, put the real time and effort in and test it and validate.
Yeah. So now it depends, right? So it depends what your scale is, because if you're doing hundreds of sales calls, then you really need to use tools like Chorus. I think it's Chorus AI. So there are a couple tools. Gong is another one.
Yep.
So there are a couple tools that will do real-time analysis of a sales call, and it'll literally tell you, like, when you mention the pitch, before 7 minutes, like you get 20% more sales on it. Like that, when you have that volume, you need to really dial it in that way. But if you don't have the volume, and like in my business, I never have had that level of volume because I'm running a boutique coaching service, you'd have to listen to recordings, and you don't need training, honestly. Like if you listen to a recording of yourself doing a sales pitch and you don't find something that could have been done better, or a place where somebody paused or something, it's then you're not listening. And actually, this is slightly adjacent to that, but one of the tips I learned a long time ago for speaking that I always love, and I think applies to the sales calls, this I forgot what his name is, but he would tell you, record yourself giving a talk. Like actually record this video, giving a talk. And then he said, go back and watch the video without sound, and then watch it, and then listen to it without watching it, just the audio, and then listen and watch both. And you will pick up on so much things. So there's so much to be learned from re-listening, but people don't take the time to do that.
Correct. This goes back to maybe the whole point is people they don't want to make that investment, I don't know, in general, in so many different things, processes, learning, you name it. I don't know, we're going to run out of time here, but is it a fear level? Is it fear? Is it you don't want to see the bad things that you're doing wrong?
It's hard work. We want to run lean and mean and fast and, do fun things, and that doesn't feel fun, but it should be fun. That's the thing. You have to flip that perspective. It is fun to sort of dial in those things. And we have to get away from this idea that, like, rather than just bring in more leads, right, and like lose them or not service them well, but like we're getting those sales, focus on the leads that we have and the people that are there and how we can, make more out of that. And like, that's where the optimization is. Rather than adding, let's work with what we have right now. And if you have 100 clients that are happy with you and paying for you, and you're focusing on getting 1,000 more, there's a mistake there. And there's not even a mistake, it's a loss of opportunity.
On that note, I want to make sure you got on time. I might need to get you back on if we can, because I have a ton of other questions we missed here. It didn't get time for. If there's a single piece of advice that you would give every single entrepreneur for excellence, how would you boil this all down into a single piece of advice, and what would that be?
Constantly looking at ways you can replace yourself. That's it, really. So you look at like the things that you do on a regular basis, write down 20 of them, right? And then decide the 80-20, the 16 things of those that you're not going to be doing in a year. Just write out that list, and that's going to be hard. But then try to figure out how you're going to make those 16 things go away. And it's going to be either optimizing it, automating it, or outsourcing it.
Yep. And I assume the same thing can apply to a business as well, right? Like different processes, like things that they can start outsourcing, moving off their plate.
Yeah, well, some of those things that you do are going to be those processes.
Yep. How can folks get in touch if they want to learn more, have chats with you, just have a great conversation? Where can they find you, get in touch, read about you, learn from you?
So everything is at lessdoing.com. All my programs, books, everything. But people actually can get in touch with me directly. You can go to talktoari.com and get on a platform called Carbon that I know are familiar with. And you'll get me. It's not a VA, it's not automation. It will be me directly. And we've talked about your biggest productivity challenges.
Highly recommend it. Everyone should be focused on that. It's the small things that lead to a fantastic business in many cases. So, Ari, thank you so much for the time. It is precious. Thank you for spending some of it with me.